one of the scholars I really like is David Mitrani, a British who wrote in the 1960s about the EU. And the reason I cite him often is because he always contrasted functionalism and federalism. He made the point that you have two pathways to integration, and he said, if you have functionalism, you look at where does it make sense to integrate in terms of security, governance, or economics, and wherever it makes sense, there you integrate. So in other words, the function of integration should dictate what kind of form it takes at the end. But he said that what's dangerous on the European continent, his continental counterparts, is that many of them, especially the Germans, had a federalist model, that they already decided on a form we're going to centralize into United States of Europe. And in order to do so, we will just transfer competencies and centralize power wherever we can. So in other words, the form is decided, and this will determine the functions later on. And from this, he made the point that we're not going to become the United States of Europe. We're going to look more like the Soviet Union when this is over. It's going to be less economically competitive, worse democracy, worse security. And, I like it not because these are something one would hope for, but it's quite accurate in terms of understanding what's happened now 60 years later. But the reason I want to bring to NATO is it feels like this is the same place, a problem for NATO as well. When it was formed, it had a clear purpose. How do we contain the Soviet Union? This was the ideal form. Wonderful, it can work then. But then after the Cold War, we obsessed about keeping the form. So the United States would remain on our continent. So we openly talked, how can we keep the form? Well, we're going to have to start to expand or out of area. So all of these were new reasons to exist. So we need this form. Let's look for other functions that allows us to keep this form. And then, of course, things begin to go very bad very quickly, I think. But no, I would like to see what you think this security strategy will do to NATO, because it doesn't look great so far. Well, if you like NATO, that is.
Yeah, no, I strongly agree. I mean, I've served with NATO formations. I think I might have mentioned before that when I was in Standing NATO Force Mediterranean, we jokingly used to say that NATO stood for no ability to organize. And one of the issues about NATO is that it's not the great alliance that people say, and this is obvious. And I think you're quite right. I love that difference in form and function, because I think it really matters. I think that up to the end of the Cold War, then it was functional, and that all worked. And I think those of us who served in it I was proud to serve in it, and it was a powerful form. But largely speaking, because the Americans provided not only the backbone of it in terms of military muscle, but also the framework for it in terms of how it was commanded and how that was all put together, because there was a single unified command. So, and with two deputies, Supreme Allied Commander Europe and Supreme Allied Commander Atlantic. And the system worked. I can remember doing NATO exercises where we used to cross the Atlantic with 4 US carrier battle routes moving at speed, 1 or 2 British carriers going ahead of them to actually sweep for submarines, and all ending up in Vesterfjord, probably not northern parts of Norway, where they would be ready to respond to a Russian attack in Central Europe. But the Cold War ended. And then, as you said, people started to look for other functions for NATO, as opposed to asking the fundamental question, do we need it? And even in those early days, people like, the great strategic thinkers like George Kennan were beginning to question some of the ideas that were being presented, not least of all, which was NATO expansionism. And of course, NATO expansionism, we now know, in fact, a lot of us knew beforehand, was a fundamental mistake. It did exactly what the Russians predicted it would do, which has led to war on the continent of Europe. But I think when you look at NATO, you see some other things as well. So I wrote a paper, again, I'm happy to leave this with you for viewers, but it was for responsible statecraft. And I explained that NATO, as it currently stands, was weak. I had a bit of history, which was that NATO was partly responsible in Kosovo, although Kosovo is a very questionable intervention, I think. And even though I was part of it and didn't see it at the time, the logic that NATO used for intervening in Kosovo is exactly the same, if not worse logic, than the Russians used for intervening in the Donbass. So we can't really have it both ways. What was next? Next was Afghanistan. I was out in Afghanistan in 2007 with NATO in place. There was no strategy. And it became clear to me at that stage that NATO couldn't do strategy. My brother was recently, I say recently, but a few years ago, while he was still serving in the NATO headquarters, and he was struck by how overmanned it was in terms of senior officers, and really bloated would be the best way I would describe it. In the article, I explained that actually, if Europe was ever in war with Russia, that we would lose. I explained that the core to actually winning a war against Russia would be an American army, which at the moment is too small anyway. It's about 427,000, I think. Next, you'd have to get that army across the Atlantic. That would mean that we would need substantial anti-submarine and mine warfare forces. They're now a third of the size that they were at the end. Thirdly, when they get across here, they and all our energy infrastructure is vulnerable with no defense against Russian hypersonic missiles. Imagine a hypersonic missile arriving in somewhere like a liquid natural gas place like Milford Haven in Wales. The results of that we analysed in 2002 would be subnuclear and really do massive damage to Britain's infrastructure. Same with places like Rotterdam, and I can't remember which one it is in Spain. There's another big hydrocarbon stations. How do you then fight the war? And we have forces in the West which would be up against a Russian army with 3.5 years of experience when we've got none. I think we'd be decimated, if you want my honest opinion, Glenn. And last but by no means least, NATO can't do strategy. I explained that they couldn't do it in Afghanistan, and that was lost against a ragtag bunch of Taliban. And we've now lost again, notwithstanding the fact that we know that there are American and British generals and probably others in Ramstein directing operations. So, it all tells me that NATO is well past its sell-by date. And I think the way to approach this is starting to think about the functions, as you say, opposed to the form. And I think there's a philosophical change that's needed, which is a philosophical change from what we call deterrence. And we call deterrence, and our approach to deterrence is let's deter Russia by marching up to its borders. Now, that's not deterrence, it's actually confrontation. And I think we've got to shift from an idea of confrontational security, which we know hasn't worked, to one of cooperative security. So I don't know what the right mechanism is, but if I had to have a starting point, then I'd close down NATO tomorrow, even if the Americans don't do it, and I think it's likely that they will. And I'd look across to the OSCE. It's not a perfect organization by any means, but the clue's in the title, cooperation in Europe. And I do like the phrase, which you will probably know better than me. It's Gorbachev's phrase of a common European home. And I think actually moving towards cooperative security across Europe and the mainlands of Europe and starting to work again with Russia is the answer to actually developing that common European home